By the third week of December, the line for Alara's Pralines started before the sun was up. A shuffling, dark-coated serpent of want that curled from her cabin door, past the dead-looking lilacs and out onto the rutted lane. Men who had laughed at her in October now stood with their hats in their hands, their breath pluming in the bitter air, waiting. They carried coins wrapped in handkerchiefs and whispered about the taste, a thing of such impossible sweetness and toasted warmth it felt like a memory of a summer no one had actually lived through. They said it was a miracle. They said she was a witch. They said her name with a new kind of weight, the syllables reshaped by need. Alara herself paid the line no mind. She was inside by the fire, doing the arithmetic. 112 pounds of shelled pecans left, 70 pounds of sugar, 18 pounds of butter. Enough for 3 more days of selling, if she was careful. The arithmetic was the only thing that was real.
The rest, the praise, the desperate eyes, the sudden respect, was just weather, and weather always changed. She had learned that well. She tipped a measure of sugar into the heavy copper pot, a pot that had belonged to her grandmother, and listened for the familiar hiss as it met the heat. It was a sound like a secret being told. 9 months earlier, that secret had cost her $6 and the entirety of her reputation. 9 months earlier, Alara had been a fool, and the whole town of Redemption, Texas, had been more than happy to tell her so. It had been a day of brutal, unseasonal cold in late March, a frost that fell like a shroud over the awakening land. It had killed the peach blossoms and blackened the new leaves on the cottonwoods, and it had cracked open nearly every pecan in Silas Sterling's vast groves, a neat, sharp line running down the shell as if drawn by a razor. The nuts were ruined for market. A whole pecan was a commodity. A cracked one was trash, an open door for mold and weevils. Sterling, a man whose wealth was matched only by his profound lack of generosity, declared the entire harvest a loss. He held an auction, not of hope, but of disposal. 400 pounds of hog feed, he denounced from the courthouse steps, his voice slick with theatrical self-pity. Frost-cracked and worthless for anything else. What am I bid for the lot? To haul it away. The crowd, mostly farmers and merchants, had been silent. It was a public performance of a rich man's misfortune, and they knew their role was to look sympathetic while feeling privately relieved it wasn't them. Then Alara, standing at the back, her shawl pulled tight, had spoken. Her voice was quiet, but it carried in the still, cold air. $6. A wave of murmurs rippled through the men. Sterling squinted, locating the source of the sound. He saw her, a young woman, alone, widowed 2 years past and scraping by on a patch of land everyone knew was more clay than soil. A flicker of contempt crossed his face, quickly replaced by a magnanimous smile. $6 from the widow Vance, he boomed, as if announcing a great act of charity. A fine price for hog feed. A woman alone knows the value of thrift. Sold. The gavel cracked down, and the sound sealed her fate. Men turned to look at her, some with pity, others with the kind of open mockery reserved for the truly witless. $6 was nearly all she had, and she'd spent it on trash. As she walked home, the whispers followed her like burrs on a hem. Lost her senses with her husband. Spending her last on cracked nuts, she'll be begging by May. She didn't look at them. She kept her eyes on the road ahead, her chin held at an angle that was not quite defiance, but something closer to resolve. She was used to being an object of the town's collective pity, a quiet footnote in their public story. A young woman alone was a problem to be solved, or a tragedy to be lamented, and since she refused to be the former, they settled on the latter. Her husband had left her the small cabin and 3 acres of hard-pan clay that grew stones better than it grew corn.
He had also left her with a quiet stubbornness she hadn't known she possessed until she was left to wield it on her own. She arrived at the edge of her property and saw him already there. Davy, the blacksmith's youngest son, a boy of 14 with arms too long for his sleeves and a shock of hair the color of straw. He was perched on her fence, kicking his heels. He was another of the town's footnotes, too dreamy for the forge, too clumsy for the fields. "Heard you bought Mr. Sterling's pecans," he said, not as a question. "I did." "Heard you paid $6. "I did." He hopped off the fence. "Figured you might need help hauling them." She looked at his thin frame, then nodded. "I would. I can pay you in, well, I'll figure something out." Davy just shrugged. "Don't need pay. Nothing else to do." The next day they took her rickety wagon to Sterling's property. The pecans were piled in burlap sacks near the barn, looking like heaps of discarded refuse. Sterling watched them from his porch, a smug little smile on his face. He made a show of calling out, "Be sure to check for weevils, Mrs. Vance. Wouldn't want your hogs getting sick." Alara didn't answer. She just hefted the first sack with Davy, the weight of it a solid, undeniable thing. It was her burden now. They made 4 trips, the wagon wheels groaning under the strain. By dusk, the sacks were piled high against the wall of her cabin, a mountain of public foolishness. Davy stood, wiping sweat from his brow with a dusty forearm. "What are you going to do with them all, Alara?" he asked, the first time he'd used her given name. She looked at the pile, at the hundreds of pounds of failure. She didn't have an answer, not a full one. She only had a flicker of a memory, a scent of something her Creole grandmother used to make, a whisper of a possibility. Before she could try to explain, a slow, shuffling figure came up the path from the creek. It was Mrs. Dubois, an ancient woman who had come from Louisiana years ago and was regarded by the town as both a source of potent remedies and a person to be generally avoided. Her face was a beautiful map of wrinkles, and she leaned heavily on a cypress stick. She stopped and peered at the sacks, her dark eyes sharp. "They laugh," she said, her voice a low, gravelly hum, accented and warm. It wasn't a question. "They do," Alara admitted. Mrs. Dubois reached into the nearest sack and pulled out a single pecan. She turned it over in her palm, her thumb tracing the fracture line. "The world fears the broken thing, ma chérie," she said softly. She held the nut up to the fading light. "But that is how God lets the light in. It is how the sweetness gets in too." She looked from the nut to Alara, a deep, knowing look that felt like a gift. "You come see me tomorrow. We will see what sweetness we can find." Alara went the next morning. Mrs. Dubois' cabin was tucked into a bend of the creek, surrounded by overgrown herbs that scented the air with mint and rosemary. Inside, it was a single room, clean and orderly, dominated by a large hearth and a collection of heavy copper and iron pots. The old woman was sitting at a small table, a bowl of shelled pecans in front of her. She had already been at work. "Sit," she commanded gently, pushing a small, sharp knife toward Alara. "The work is in the hands first, then the head." For hours they sat in comfortable silence, the only sounds the rhythmic crack and scrape of shell and the soft hiss of the fire. Alara's fingers, already calloused from farm work, quickly found the rhythm. The frost-cracked shells, so maligned at the auction, were a blessing. They fell away easily, revealing the nut meats inside. And the meats were not rotten. They were not shriveled or moldy. They were plump, pale, and perfect. More than perfect, Alara realized as she tasted one. The shock of the frost had done something to the nut, concentrating its oils, deepening its flavor into something richer and more intense than any pecan she had ever eaten. She looked up at Mrs. Dubois, her eyes wide with discovery. The old woman simply nodded, a slow smile spreading across her face. "You see? The world throws it away. The earth knows better." That afternoon, Davy showed up again, looking for work that wasn't there. Ilara put a knife in his hand and a bowl in his lap. He was clumsy at first, his big hands fumbling with the small shells, but he was patient. He listened as Ilara explained what she had found, the perfection hidden inside the flawed exterior. A slow grin spread across his face. "So Sterling's the fool, not you," he said, a note of triumph in his voice. "We're not there yet," Ilara cautioned, but she felt a warmth spread through her chest, a feeling she hadn't realized she'd been missing. It was hope. The three of them became a quiet conspiracy. Every day, after their regular chores were done, they would work on the pecans. Davy would haul a sack or two into the cabin, and they would sit for hours, shelling. The pile of empty shells grew into a small mountain behind the cabin. The shelled nut meats were stored in clean, dry barrels Ilara had scoured, lining her small, cool cellar. It was methodical, painstaking labor. Day after day, their hands grew tougher, their fingers stained dark from the oils. The town continued its judgment from a distance. The storekeeper, Mr. Henderson, would ask with false concern if she needed credit for flour, his eyes flicking toward her dwindling supplies. Women at the church social would whisper behind their hands. Ilara learned to meet their gazes with a placid stillness, a calm that they mistook for resignation. They could not see the growing store of wealth in her cellar. They could not smell the rich, oily promise of the nut meats. They only saw the girl who had bought trash. By the end of April, they had shelled over 100 pounds. Ilara would go down to the cellar at night, a single candle in her hand, and just look at the barrels. She would run her hands through the cool, smooth nut meats. She did the arithmetic. Each barrel was a month of security. Each pound was a meal she wouldn't have to beg for. She was banking her future, like a coal kept low under ash, waiting for the right moment to be fanned into flame. In May, Mrs. Dubois declared it was time. "The hands have done their work," she said, wiping her own on her apron. "Now, the fire." She didn't use a recipe book. The knowledge was in her movements, in the way she measured sugar by the heft of the scoop, the way she judged the heat of the fire by holding her palm over the flames. Ilara watched, memorizing everything. The old woman taught her how to toast the pecans just so, until they released their fragrant oil but did not burn. She showed her how to melt the butter and brown sugar, how to watch for the exact moment the syrup reached the soft ball stage, a mystery of temperature and time that could only be learned by sight and feel. "Patience, chérie," Mrs. Dubois would murmur, her hand stopping Ilara's when she moved to stir too soon. "You cannot rush the sweetness." Their first batch was small, just a dozen pralines scooped onto a buttered marble slab that had once been a piece of a fancy city fireplace. They cooled into flat amber discs, studded with toasted pecan halves. The air in the cabin grew thick with the scent of caramel, butter, and roasted nuts, a smell so profoundly comforting it felt like a prayer. Mrs. Dubois broke one in half. The snap was clean and crisp. She handed a piece to Ilara and one to Davy, who had been watching with wide, hungry eyes. Ilara put the candy in her mouth. It was unlike anything she had ever tasted. It was crunchy at the edges, but the center melted on her tongue in a wave of creamy, complex sweetness. The deep, almost smoky flavor of the brown sugar, perfectly balanced by the rich, earthy pecans and the saltiness of the butter. It was not just candy, it was something more.
Davy's eyes were closed in bliss.
It's like sunshine, he whispered, and for once his dreamy description felt perfectly accurate. They made batch after batch, Ilara's movements growing more confident, her senses more attuned to the alchemy of the process. She learned the exact shade of amber the syrup should be, the precise feel of the spoon as the mixture began to crystallize. Mrs. Dubois acted as her guide, tasting, nodding, offering small corrections. A little more vanilla, a pinch more salt. Let this one cool slower. They did not sell them, not yet. Ilara wrapped each perfect praline in waxed paper and laid them carefully in tins, which she stored in the cool darkness of the cellar next to the barrels of raw nuts. It was a secret hoard of sweetness. Every night she would add to it, and every night she would do the arithmetic. So many pecans shelled, so many pralines made, so much potential wealth sitting silent beneath her floorboards, while the world above thought her a pauper. She refused all offers of help from the town, all condescending gifts of a half-full sack of flour or a basket of last week's eggs. Her refusal puzzled them. A proud poor woman was a difficult thing for the town of Redemption to understand. They preferred their objects of charity to be grateful. Ilara's quiet self-reliance was an affront. It felt like a judgment on them, and they didn't know why. One hot afternoon in early July, a fancy carriage, the kind rarely seen in Redemption, pulled up in front of Ilara's cabin. A well-dressed man in a city suit stepped out, fanning himself with his hat and looking with distaste at the dusty yard. He was looking for the blacksmith, he explained, but his horse had thrown a shoe and he was parched. "Might I trouble you for a dipper of water, madam?" he asked, his voice smooth and tired. Ilara brought him water from her well, cool and clean. As he drank, his eyes scanned the simple, almost bare cabin, and a look of professional pity settled on his features. She knew the look well. He was calculating her poverty. On an impulse she didn't fully understand, she went inside and came back with a single, paper-wrapped praline. "For the road," she said, holding it out. He looked at the small, plain package, clearly hesitant to accept food from such a humble source. But manners won out. He unwrapped it, his expression doubtful. He took a small, testing bite. His face froze. The smooth mask of city politeness dissolved, replaced by pure, unadulterated shock. He stared at the praline in his hand as if it were a gold nugget. He took another, larger bite, and his eyes closed. He chewed slowly, a look of profound concentration on his face. "My God," he said, his voice a reverent whisper. He opened his eyes and looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time. The pity was gone, replaced by a sharp, calculating gleam. "Where did you get this?" "I made it," she said simply. This is extraordinary," he said, his voice full of energy now. "The flavor of the nuts, the texture, it's perfect. I am the head chef for the Excelsior Hotel in Austin. We have senators, cattle barons. They would kill for a confection like this. I have never tasted its equal." He reached into his coat. "I will buy every single one you have. Name your price." Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it, the moment of proof, the validation from the outside world. She could sell them all, right now. Pay off her husband's debts. Be secure. But she looked at the man, at the hungry, proprietary gleam in his eye, and she thought of the barrels in her cellar, the quiet promise they held. She thought of Mrs. Dubois' words, "You cannot rush the sweetness." It was not yet time. "They are not for sale," she said. The chef stared at her, dumbfounded. "Not for sale? Madam, you don't understand. I will pay you handsomely. $20 for a box, 30. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice steady. "They are not ready." He argued, he cajoled, he pleaded. He could not comprehend her refusal. To him, she was a poor woman sitting on a treasure she was too foolish to sell. He finally left, frustrated and confused, pressing his card into her hand. "If you change your mind, when you change your mind." She watched his carriage disappear in a cloud of dust, the card still in her hand. Davy, who had seen the whole exchange from the shade of the porch, came over. $30 a box? He breathed, his eyes wide. You could be rich, Alara. Wealth is not just money, Davy, she said, tucking the card into her apron pocket. It's timing. But the chef's visit had changed something. It had lit the fuse. The confidence she had been carefully nurturing in secret now settled into her bones, solid and sure. She was no longer hoping. She was waiting. The rest of the summer passed in a haze of heat and work. August arrived like the open door of a furnace, baking the clay of Alara's yard into cracked tiles. The creek slowed to a muddy trickle. The corn in the fields of her neighbors grew stunted and pale. The old-timers watched the sky, which remained a pitiless, searing blue, and shook their heads. There was no rain in it. Mrs. Dubois, reading the signs in the land that no one else bothered to notice, grew quiet and grim. One afternoon she pointed with her cypress stick to the sugar cane growing in a small, experimental patch by the river. Its leaves, which should have been a vibrant green, were tinged with a sickly yellow and dotted with red lesions. La houille, she murmured. The rust. It is in the cane. The harvest will be bad. The sugar will be dear. The next day, Alara hitched her wagon and went to town. She walked into Henderson's mercantile, past the pickle barrels and bolts of calico, and went to the counter. Mr. Henderson gave her his usual look of weary condescension. "Come for some credit, Alara?" he asked, already shaking his head. "I have cash," she said, placing a small, heavy cloth bag on the counter. It was the last of her husband's savings, money she had guarded for a true emergency. Henderson's eyebrows shot up at the clink of coins. "I want to buy your entire stock of brown sugar," she said, "and all your butter." Henderson stared at her as if she had grown a second head. It was a preposterous purchase. No one bought sugar in such quantities, not unless they were a baker for a whole army. It would spoil. It would attract every ant and mouse in the county. "All of it?" he stammered. That's more than $20 worth." "I am aware of the arithmetic," she said quietly. The mockery in his eyes warred with the greed of a merchant smelling a big sale. Greed won. He weighed out the sugar, sack after sack, and wrapped the blocks of butter from his icebox. The purchase emptied her coin purse and filled her wagon. The news of it traveled through Redemption before she had even finished loading the last sack. It was the final proof, for those who still needed it, that the widow Vance had taken a permanent leave of her senses. First cracked nuts, now a mountain of sugar she could never hope to use. Silas Sterling, hearing the news, had laughed out loud in the middle of the street. "The poor woman is trying to corner the market on foolishness," he declared to the men gathered on the mercantile porch. Alara heard him as she clicked the reins. She didn't turn. She just drove her wagon home, her jaw set. She was not gambling. She was acting on better information. She and Davy spent the next 2 days hauling the sacks and barrels into the cool, dark cellar. It was now a fortress of sweetness, a vault of potential. Barrels of shelled pecans, tins of finished pralines, and now, sacks of sugar and crates of butter. While the town laughed, Alara had quietly assembled all the components of a small miracle. She had everything she needed. Now, all she had to do was wait for the world to realize how badly it needed her. By October, The predictions of the old-timers and the wisdom of Mrs. Dubois had come true with a vengeance. The drought had not broken. The corn harvest was a disaster, the ears small and withered on the stalk. The cotton bolls were stunted. Worse, the news from downriver was dire. The rust had decimated the sugarcane fields. The sugar refineries, with little cane to process, were shutting down. The price of sugar, when it could be found at all, quadrupled overnight. Henderson's Mercantile, which had sold its entire stock to Alara for a song, now had none to offer. The shelves were bare. A quiet panic began to settle over the town.
Redemption, like most small towns, marked its year by small joys and rituals. The harvest festival, the church bake sales, the approach of Christmas, all were sweetened with sugar. A year without sugar was a year without landmarks, a grim, monotonous stretch of hardship. There would be no pies, no cakes, no candies. There would be no small sweetness to blunt the sharp edge of a difficult year. The mood of the town soured. The laughter that had been directed at Alara died on their lips, replaced by the pinched, anxious expressions of people facing a long, joyless winter. Silas Sterling was hit particularly hard. His wealth was tied up in commodities, in the predictable rhythms of harvest and sale. He had a warehouse full of whole pecans from a previous, better year. But with no sugar, the bakeries and confectioners who usually bought them had no orders. His assets were frozen. His public displays of magnanimity vanished, replaced by a sour, impatient anger. His pride was wounded, and a man like Sterling could withstand the loss of money far better than the loss of face. He saw Alara in town one day and sneered. "Still got all that sugar, Mrs. Vance? Perhaps you can eat it with a spoon all winter. It's all it's good for now." Alara met his gaze. "Perhaps," she said, and walked on. She felt the shift in the town's perception of her. She was no longer just an object of pity or scorn. She was an anomaly. In a town defined by a collective, spreading lack, she was a quiet island of abundance. They didn't know the specifics of what was in her cellar, but they knew she had bought the sugar. They remembered the pecans. They started to watch her, not with mockery, but with a dawning, fearful curiosity. The arithmetic had changed. Her foolishness was beginning to look like something else entirely. It was not yet wisdom, not in their eyes, but it was no longer madness. One person alone, they had said. A woman alone could not run a place. A woman alone would surely fail. But as the days grew shorter and the nights colder, Ilara's solitude began to look less like a weakness and more like a strength. She owed no one. She depended on no one. She had what she needed. The town, which had defined itself by its communal judgment of her, was beginning to fracture under the weight of its own shared hardship. Hunger changes a town. But the hunger for sweetness, for a small taste of joy in a bitter time, changes it even more profoundly. On the 1st of December, a small hand-lettered sign appeared on Alara's gate. It read, "Pralines, 10 cents. The news spread through Redemption like fire in a dry field. Pralines, a word from another world, a world of plenty that had vanished. At first, no one came. It was easier to believe a thing was rotten than to admit you were wrong to mock it. They whispered that she must be using the spoiled nuts after all, that it was a trick. Then the blacksmith, Davy's father, a man of few words and great weariness, walked to her door. His wife was sick and had been craving something sweet for weeks. He held out a dime as if it were his last hope. "I'll take one," he said, his voice gruff. Ilara took his coin and gave him 2 pralines wrapped in wax paper. He walked away, unwrapping one. He stopped, took a bite, and stood perfectly still in the middle of the road for a long moment.
Then he turned and walked back. "I'll take 4 more," he said. After that, the dam broke. People came in a trickle, then a steady stream. They came with their dimes held tight, their faces a mixture of skepticism and desperate hope. Each one left with a look of stunned wonder, the taste of that impossible sweetness lingering on their tongue. They were not just buying candy. They were buying a reprieve. They were buying a moment of warmth in a cold season. By the end of the first week, the line began before dawn. The sound of her business was the clink of dimes in a tin box and the low murmur of voices sharing the same sentiment. "Have you tasted it?" Ilara, Davy, and Mrs. Dubois, who now supervised from a rocking chair by the fire, worked from before sunrise until well after dark. Davy managed the crowd, his lanky awkwardness replaced by a newfound sense of purpose. He took the coins, kept the line orderly, and felt, for the first time, essential. Ilara worked the copper pot, her movements a fluid, practiced dance of heat and sugar and patience. She was no longer the town fool. She was the source. She kept her prices fair. 10 cents was not cheap, but it was not the gouging price she could have demanded. She knew the arithmetic of her costs, and she knew the arithmetic of her neighbor's want, and she chose a number that honored both. This, more than anything, baffled and infuriated Silas Sterling. He saw the line outside her cabin, a daily testament to his own misjudgment. He had sold her the foundation of her fortune for the price of hog feed. He, the shrewdest businessman in the county, had been outmaneuvered by a reclusive widow and a dreamy boy. He saw her earning more in a day from his ruined nuts than he was making in a week. His envy curdled into a cold, focused rage. It was not right. A woman alone should not be allowed to possess such power. It was an affront to the natural order of things. Sterling made his move during the second week of December. He arrived not in a carriage, but on foot, walking to the front of the line with 2 of his cronies from the town council. He did not wait. He strode to Ilara's door and knocked, the sound loud and authoritative. Davy tried to stop him. "There's a line, Mr. Sterling." Sterling shoved the boy aside. "I'm here on official business." Ilara opened the door, her hands covered in sugar. She looked at him, her expression calm. "There is a line," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "This isn't a social call, Mrs. Vance," Sterling said, his voice oozing false concern. "There are whispers, rumors, that these nuts you are using are unsafe, that they were frost-damaged, rotten. As a concerned citizen and member of the town council, I feel it is my duty to inspect your product and your premises for the public good." It was a transparent ploy. He wanted to get inside, to see her operation, to find some pretext to shut her down or, better yet, take control. The people in line, who had once been his chorus of mockery, now murmured in protest. They had tasted the pralines. They knew they were not rotten. "My nuts are not rotten, Mr. Sterling," Ilara said. "They are perfect." "A claim easily made," he sneered. "But how would you know? You bought 400 pounds. How could one woman and a boy possibly have inspected them all?" A voice came from the line. It was the blacksmith. "Because they shelled every last one of them by hand, Sterling. My boy was there. I saw the blisters on his hands for 2 months straight." Other voices joined in. "They're the best thing I've tasted in my life." "Leave her be, Sterling. She's the only one who has anything to sell." The crowd was turning on him. His own town. He was losing control, his face flushed with anger. "This is a matter of public health. I demand an inspection." He tried to push his way past her into the cabin. Ilara didn't move. She stood in the doorway, a small woman made immovable by her resolve. "You are not coming into my home, Mr. Sterling." "I have the authority," he blustered. "It was not authority you were looking for when you sold me the pecans," she replied, her voice still quiet, but now it had an edge of steel. "You were looking to salvage your pride. You declared them worthless. Were you lying then, or are you lying now?" The question hung in the cold air, sharp and deadly. It exposed the core of his hypocrisy. He was trapped. If the nuts were worthless then, he had no claim. If they were valuable, he had been a fool to sell them. He stared at her, his face a mask of fury. He had underestimated her. They all had. They had seen a poor, grieving widow. They had not seen the woman of iron and fire standing before him now. He had no answer. For the first time in his public life, Silas Sterling was speechless. He turned, his face dark with humiliation, and stalked away, his cronies trailing behind him like defeated dogs. The line of people let out a small, collective cheer. Alara simply nodded, a small acknowledgement of their support, and turned back to her copper pot. The sugar was waiting. The final vindication came not with a shout, but with a choice. It was the day of the Christmas market, a sparse and melancholy affair that year. The usual stalls selling cakes and pies were empty. There was a grim pall over the town square. Then Alara and Davy arrived, pulling the old wagon, but this time it was laden not with cracked nuts, but with tins of treasure. They set up a simple table. The entire town seemed to gravitate toward it, drawn by the scent of hope. Alara had done the arithmetic one last time. She had enough for every family in town to have at least a small bag for Christmas Day. She could have charged a fortune. She could have demanded $1 a praline, and they would have paid it. She saw Sterling watching her from across the square, his face a thundercloud of resentment, expecting her to exact her revenge through price. Instead, she put up a new sign. "Pralines, 5 cents today." A gasp went through the crowd. She had halved the price. Then she added another sign below it. "For those with nothing, pay what you can, or pay later. Merry Christmas." It was an act of such unexpected, radical generosity that it stunned the town into silence. It was not business, it was grace. One by one they came forward. The blacksmith paid his dime and took his bag, his eyes meeting Alara's with a look of profound respect. A mother with 3 small children offered 2 pennies and a prayer. Alara filled her bag to the top. The town that had mocked her now lined up to receive her gift, their pride humbled by their need and her kindness. She was not just selling them candy, she was restoring a piece of their broken community, sweetening their shared hardship. Sterling could only watch as his power, which was built on money and fear, evaporated in the face of her power, which was built on work, patience, and generosity. He was a rich man in a poor town, but on that day, he was the poorest man there. He had lost the one thing that mattered, the respect of his neighbors. He turned and walked away, and no one watched him go. As dusk fell and the last praline was sold, Mrs. Dubois appeared, leaning on her stick. Davy was packing up the empty tins, his face glowing with a pride he had never known. Alara was tired, down to her bones, but she was smiling. Mrs. Dubois picked up a single cracked pecan shell that had fallen into the bottom of the wagon. She held it up in the twilight. "You see, ma chérie," she said, her voice soft. "The world fears the broken thing. It throws it away." She looked at Alara, her eyes shining with tears. "But it is the only thing that can ever be made whole again." Alara looked around the square, at the lights beginning to glow in the windows, and knew it was true. She had started with nothing but another's cast-off refuse and her own stubborn heart. She had taken what was broken and, with patience and quiet labor, had found the sweetness inside. She had not only saved herself, she had, in a small but essential way, saved the town from its own bitter winter. The arithmetic was finally complete.